Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Stellar HFY. First, I want to say thank you. The support you've shown for these stories lately has been incredible. Today, we're stepping into one of the most dangerous trials ever imagined in the Orion frontier, the Predator test. No species had ever passed it. This is the story of Captain Reese Maddox, the man who turned survival into a weapon and forced an empire to change the way it saw humanity forever. Let's start. The chamber was silent when the Quran delegation stepped forward. Every envoy present knew the move before it was made. They could feel the weight of the words that followed. The Predator test had been invoked. It wasn't a trial for glory, and it wasn't an invitation to sport. It was a declaration, cloaked in the language of diplomacy, that one species was about to be humbled. Every empire at the table understood exactly what it meant. The Quran were daring humanity to fail in public, to prove before allied eyes that Earth was not ready for the demands of the frontier. It was as much a political maneuver as it was a challenge, and the room understood the stakes. Refusal would be interpreted as weakness. Acceptance risked public humiliation. Either way, the Quran had set the trap. On Earth, the Council didn't debate the challenge for long. The test's rules were well known, and its record was unbroken. No species had passed. That was the point. The Quran used it to remind allies of their military dominance. If humanity declined, the consequences would be immediate. Loss of leverage in armistice negotiations, reduced access to critical defense packs, and eventual isolation from shared operations along the frontier. The question wasn't whether to respond. The question was who to send. The choice had to make sense tactically, politically, and symbolically. Captain Reese Maddox's name surfaced early. His record in deep reconnaissance deployments was clean but not high profile. Extensive operations in Amazon and Congolese jungles, terrain where movement was dictated by patience, not brute force. He was skilled but politically expendable if things went wrong. That combination made him an easy name to select. Maddox didn't argue the decision. His career had taught him that some assignments were less about orders and more about consequences. He understood that this wasn't a mission built for victory. It was a demonstration. His role was to show that humanity could face the test without flinching. Whether he passed or failed was almost secondary to the act of taking the field. Still, in private, he studied the limited intelligence available. The Predator test was set on a Koran border world jungle, an environment meticulously replicated within the Quran simulation arena. It was a carefully controlled hunting ground designed to highlight the Predator's advantages. The layout was deceptively simple. A beacon was positioned at the far end of the hunting zone. The participants' objective was to reach it alive. Between the starting point and the beacon lay kilometers of layered canopy, heavy undergrowth, and dense fog that held in heat and moisture. The environment interfered with standard tracking systems and weapon sensors. The Predators were not random. They operated as an apex unit, a six-limbed species bred and trained for coordinated hunting. They moved in formation, herding their quarry, cutting off escape vectors, and driving the test subject into open zones where the final strike was inevitable. The challenge wasn't in fighting them directly. The challenge was in moving through their territory without being neutralized. When the day arrived, the arena's stands filled with observers. Quran delegates stood in the prime seats, allied envoys arrayed behind them. Every empire had sent someone to watch, because the Predator test was never just about the trial. It was about the spectacle. Maddox stood at the edge of the entry gate, stripped of any advantage beyond light field gear and his choice of basic survival tools. He took no weapon beyond a short machete and a standard-issue survival pack. To most watching, the restraint looked like an acceptance of inevitable failure. Maddox saw it differently. Weight was noise. Unnecessary gear would slow him down in ways that mattered more than raw speed. The gates opened, and the first sound was the unbroken quiet of the simulated jungle. It was a silence that wasn't natural. Maddox recognized it immediately, an intentional stillness, the kind that existed when predators had already moved into position. In jungle operations on Earth, he had learned to read the terrain by what wasn't happening: the absence of insect hum, the lack of small animal calls, the damp stillness of the air. These were signals of movement that didn't belong. He took a step forward, feeling the difference in the ground beneath him, the soft compression of soil that had been pressed down repeatedly. Even in a simulation, the environment followed its own logic. From the Corin viewing deck, nothing remarkable seemed to happen. Maddox didn't sprint, didn't break into the erratic movement that had marked the panic of other species challengers. He moved at a measured pace, stepping off the main approach path and vanishing into the denser undergrowth to his left. The predators began their formation sweep almost immediately, 6 figures moving with a precision that looked rehearsed because it was. Maddox wasn't watching them. He was watching the spaces they avoided, the terrain features they didn't waste time on. Their movements left small pockets of ground untouched, areas that were likely considered inefficient for a hunt. Maddox wasn't looking for safety, he was looking for time. The ground sloped gently toward a deeper section of the jungle, where the canopy thickened and the air felt heavier. Maddox paused to study the way the moisture collected on the leaves, the faint mist rising where sunlight filtered through gaps above. The heavy saturation was more than a natural feature. It would scatter thermal imaging. Predators relying on heat signatures would have difficulty maintaining a lock in this environment. He adjusted course deliberately, moving toward the zone with no sign of urgency. The Quran wouldn't see his reasoning, but that was fine. He wasn't performing for them. Every step deeper into the jungle was a calculation. Maddox kept his profile low, conserving energy, controlling his breathing. The rules of the predator test were simple, but simplicity didn't mean fairness. The predators didn't need to be faster than him. They just needed to be patient. That patience was something Maddox understood intimately. In the jungles of Earth, predators didn't rush unless they were certain. Survival meant never giving them certainty. From above, the Quran observers began marking anomalies. Maddox wasn't where their predictive systems expected him to be. The predators adjusted their formation sweep, widening the arc to close on his last projected position. Maddox didn't notice them directly. He noticed the changes in the environment that followed their movements. Slight tremors in the ground, shifts in the air. These were familiar cues. His training in Earth's jungles had been built on reading the smallest changes because nothing large announced itself in time to react. Minutes stretched as the formation tightened, but Maddox wasn't moving toward the beacon. Not yet. His first objective was to make himself harder to track, not just harder to catch. Moving into the denser foliage wasn't an escape. It was an intentional step into a zone the predators had marked as low value. In doing so, he wasn't hiding from them. He was forcing them to change their pattern to address him. Every change they made to adapt to him cost them a fraction of the control they had at the start. By the time the first hour ended, Maddox had disappeared from the standard predictive map. To the audience, it looked like little had happened. To the predators, their control of the hunt had shifted. Maddox was still alive, still moving, and still somewhere ahead of their adjusted sweep. He had entered the arena without rushing, without panic, and without spectacle. And yet, by the time he reached his first real position of cover, the hunt was already different. He wasn't running their test. He was running his own. The predators began their hunt as they always did, silent, coordinated, certain of the outcome. 6 hunters moved in a loose crescent formation, their positioning calibrated by decades of perfected practice. It was less a pursuit and more a methodical closing of space, each one subtly hurting its prey without forcing a reaction too early. Their movements were disciplined, not rushed, each step part of an invisible geometry designed to tighten until there was nowhere left to go. In previous tests, competitors had either charged blindly toward the beacon or attempted to fight their way through. Both paths ended the same way, with the predators shifting formation, cutting off escape, and executing the final strike in the open ground. The Quran observers above watched Maddox's position, certain they were about to see the familiar pattern unfold again. Maddox, however, wasn't treating their movement as a trap. To him, it was a map. His boots pressed carefully into the ground, each step measuring the give of the soil beneath. Years in Earth's jungles had trained him to read the floor as much as the canopy. The soil depressions weren't random. They were subtle tracks, worn not by prey, but by the predators themselves. Game trails on Earth were built by countless passes over the same route. These predators, despite their superiority, still relied on routine. They had preferred paths for their sweep, chosen because they gave the best angles of control over the hunt. Maddox didn't see them as danger zones. He saw them as signposts leading to where their attention was strongest and where it wasn't. He adjusted his course, keeping his pace deliberate and unhurried, angling away from the main approach line the predators expected him to take. The Quran in the observation tier noted the deviation, but dismissed it as a minor error in positioning. They didn't realize yet that Maddox wasn't lost. He was intentionally guiding himself toward the sections the predators ignored. Ahead, the foliage thickened, the air heavier and darker under the canopy. The jungle's structure was layered. Moisture clung to every surface, forming a wet curtain that trapped heat unevenly. Maddox moved toward what looked like a dead zone, a patch where the air's weight felt different, where the sound dropped further. In the Quran hunting simulations, these areas were avoided by the predators, not because they were dangerous, but because they interfered with the efficiency of their scans. Maddox slipped into the dense foliage, ducking low as the overhead leaves closed off most of the light. He didn't need to see far. He needed to feel the terrain shift under him, hear the minute changes in the ambient silence. Here, the thermal signature of anything moving was diffused and scattered, distorted by the wet leaves and saturated air. On Earth, he had experienced this in certain parts of the Amazon, lowland zones where the humidity made thermal optics unreliable, and where tracking a target was as much guesswork as science. He'd survived those environments not by outrunning what hunted him, but by using the terrain to make himself an unattractive target. Above, the Quran predators slowed as their predictive tracking failed to update cleanly. Maddox's movements were no longer aligning with their expected routes. The lead predator paused, adjusting formation slightly, widening the sweep arc to cover the unexpected gap. It was a small change, but it meant something subtle and important. Maddox had forced them to adapt. In a hunt like this, every adaptation came with a cost. The predator's strength came from operating as a unit, every member in perfect rhythm. Widening the sweep meant less overlap, thinner coverage, and slower encirclement. They were still deadly, still methodical, but the pace of their control had shifted. Maddox crouched in the damp undergrowth, listening as much as watching. The predators were close, close enough for the ground to register faint vibrations from their coordinated movement. He didn't panic. His breathing stayed controlled, his body still except for the slight flex of his fingers against the soil. Patience was as much a weapon as any blade. On Earth, he had learned that rushing was what killed people in the jungle. Panic drew predators faster than blood. Most who had failed the predator test had made the same mistake. They had treated the open moments as chances to sprint. The predators didn't stop them. They let them run, let them believe escape was close, then closed the gap where there was no cover left. He wasn't giving them that opportunity. Every choice Maddox made was designed to keep them working harder than they expected to. His pace denied them the chance to dictate when the critical engagement would happen. He didn't need to avoid them completely. He needed to keep them from setting the terms. The Quran observers began to notice the subtle change in the hunt's tempo. It wasn't dramatic. The predators weren't confused, weren't losing ground, but their formation had slowed, their sweeps drawn out. Maddox's position updates on the projection board were no longer clean arcs. Instead, his movements showed short, deliberate advances, periods of stasis, and unexpected lateral shifts. From above, it looked like inefficiency. In reality, it was control. Maddox continued deeper into the zone, the canopy tightening above. The heat was heavy, but it was an old discomfort. He'd spent days in worse conditions. The stillness here was his advantage. He could feel the predator's frustration in the faint changes of the air currents as they shifted position again. This wasn't the behavior they were used to. Most prey either bolted or stalled too long and got flushed out. Maddox was doing neither. He stopped near a thicker section of low growth, his eyes scanning the faint depression of another trail. This one was less used, likely a tertiary route the predators took to close in after forcing their quarry into a predictable escape path. It told him two things: where they liked to end their hunts and where they weren't focusing yet. If he could anticipate their endgame, he could avoid their strongest ground until it worked in his favor. The predator's sweep widened again, slower this time. Maddox's profile was still off their primary grid. They were reacquiring him in steps, not in a full lock. For the first time in the hunt, their rhythm wasn't completely their own. The Quran observers watched in silence, still confident in their outcome, but aware that the timing wasn't unfolding in its usual cadence. Maddox had bought time, not as a delay, but as a calculated asset. Every moment they were working to find him was a moment he was forcing them into patterns they didn't expect. As he moved forward again, Maddox stayed close to the densest foliage, keeping the layered cover between himself and any open angles above. He didn't look toward the beacon. That would come later. For now, the only objective was to keep the predators reacting. He could hear their movements again, distant but deliberate, no longer the seamless advance they began with. That was enough for this stage. He didn't need to win the hunt in one move. He just needed to make sure it wasn't over in the way the Quran expected. By the time the predators adjusted again, Maddox was already deeper in the dead zone. The audience didn't see anything that looked like a breakthrough. But for those who understood how the predator test worked, the first stage of control had shifted. Maddox wasn't just surviving. He was bending the grid to his own pace. The predators were still dangerous, still closing, but their hunt had slowed. And in the predator test, a shift in pace was the first sign that the ending might not follow the script. Maddox kept his breathing steady, his movement deliberate, as the sound of the predators shifted again. They were closer now, not because they had pinned him, but because they were methodically sweeping their arcs tighter. This was the part of the hunt where most prey collapsed under pressure. The longer the predators kept their quarry in motion, the more mistakes emerged. Maddox had no intention of running their pace. He had seen this kind of pressure before, just under different conditions. In South America, counter-tracking operations had taught him that survival wasn't only about evasion, it was about confusing the track itself. False scent loops, misdirected movement patterns, trails designed to fold in on themselves and send trackers circling for hours. The jungle he was in now might be alien, but the principle was the same. He stopped in a low cluster of foliage, crouching as he examined the environment. The plants here were broad-leafed, their surfaces slick with moisture, their fibrous structure perfect for holding scent. Maddox pulled a strip from one, the leaf tearing with a damp snap. He wiped it along the back of his neck and down his arms, letting it soak in sweat. Then another, wrapping it loosely and tucking it against the inside of his collar. The predators wouldn't just be tracking visually. Their sensors were layered. Thermal readings, olfactory detection, micro vibrations in the ground. If he could create the illusion of movement in more than one place, it wouldn't matter if they picked up his scent. They just have to decide which direction mattered. The vines overhead were perfect. They hung in slow arcs, moving faintly with the natural sway of the canopy. Maddox climbed a few paces into the low branches, using the machete to cut smaller vine segments. He tied strips of the sweat-soaked vegetation to them, weighting them with bits of debris so they swung with slight, uneven motions over the predator trails he'd identified earlier. It didn't take much, just enough to introduce irregular thermal spikes when the vines shifted, paired with the faint scent drifting downward. From above or through the dense foliage, the effect would appear as a moving heat and scent source, consistent with prey movement. The predators reacted almost immediately. The lead hunter in the formation slowed, its head turning toward the movement zone. It signaled silently to its partner, and two peeled off the main crescent, moving to intercept what they believed was Maddox's path. From the observation tier, the Quran noted the split but didn't register it as a problem. Predators adjusted all the time to flush prey. They had no reason to think this was anything more than a tactical maneuver. Maddox watched from his position, still crouched low, eyes on the gaps in the foliage where the predators had moved. His trap wasn't meant to stop them. It was meant to waste their time. One predator moved along the trail where the vines swung, its sensors pinging irregular signatures. It doubled back, tracking the anomaly again, reading overlapping scent trails and shifting thermal pings. The loop drew it into a slow, inefficient pursuit pattern, one that kept it circling the same ground without locking a clean trajectory. The second predator adjusted outward to compensate, unknowingly thinning the coverage in its assigned sweep zone. This was the first genuine crack in their formation. Maddox didn't rush to exploit it. Instead, he shifted his attention to where the remaining predators were adjusting. Their lines were still tight, but gaps were opening. small ones, and only in short intervals. In a hunt designed to be perfect, even these small fractures mattered. He moved with precision, taking advantage of the moments where the predator's sensors were offset by their partner's diversions. He began climbing toward a ridge he'd identified earlier. The slope was steep, overgrown with vines and moss, the surface damp but firm enough to hold his weight. It wasn't an obvious choice. On Earth, climbing in a hostile environment like this risked exposure. But here, the ridge's overhang was concealed by thick vine growth. The predators wouldn't see him unless they broke formation entirely to investigate. From higher ground, he could not only avoid their primary sweep lines, but also observe how they adjusted to the disruption he'd created. As he moved upward, his pace remained controlled. Every step was calculated, each handhold tested before he shifted his weight. The vines wrapped around his wrists and forearms, cold and wet, pulling moisture down his sleeves. He kept his profile low, moving sideways when possible to avoid silhouette exposure. The ridge offered no clear view of the beacon yet, but it wasn't about sight lines to the objective. It was about seeing the predator's next moves. Halfway up, Maddox paused, crouching in the natural cradle of the ridge's growth. From here, he could hear the predators more clearly. Their movement had lost its seamless rhythm. They were still coordinated, but the timing was slightly off. One predator was locked into its inefficient loop, its progress slow. The one compensating for it was now adjusting its own arc more frequently, doubling back to cover areas its partner had missed. The remaining hunters had subtly expanded their coverage, but each expansion came with thinner, overlapping fields. The Quran above still didn't see the problem. Their observers marked the predator's adjustments as standard variants. But Maddox saw it for what it was: control slipping by degrees. It wasn't about forcing a catastrophic failure. It was about forcing small inefficiencies that compounded over time. Every hunter moving slightly out of sync was one more second of breathing room for him. He reached the upper ridge, crouching low beneath the canopy. The vantage point was narrow, but it gave him a clearer view of two predator arcs. Their movement below was steady but not flawless. He watched them pause briefly, recalibrating their angles, then move again in slightly wider sweeps. The false scent loop was still active, vines swaying, sweat-soaked strips releasing faint traces of heat and scent into the predator paths. They wouldn't chase it forever, but every second they spent evaluating it was another second they weren't pressing him. From here, Maddox could plan his next phase. He wasn't in the clear, not even close, but the hunt had changed shape. He was no longer simply avoiding capture. He was directing their attention. His position on the ridge gave him a better sense of the terrain ahead. The jungle extended in layers, dense with canopy, the ground below breaking into uneven rises and depressions. There were still hundreds of meters to the beacon, but he now had a picture of the predator grid from above. Maddox stayed low, scanning the arcs as the predators adjusted once more. The fractured formation wouldn't collapse completely. They were too disciplined for that, but the grid coverage had undeniable gaps. Those gaps wouldn't last, but they didn't have to. He only needed enough time to move into his next position before the predators locked him again. From the ridge, he could see at least two potential paths forward, both risky, both requiring precise timing. As the predators circled below, Maddox stayed motionless, waiting. The false scent loop was still playing out in the background. One predator committed to the anomaly. The second was trying to reintegrate into the formation, but its arc was misaligned. Maddox's ridge vantage showed him exactly when their overlap would thin for a brief moment. That would be his window. He adjusted his grip on the vines, letting the damp foliage mask his movement, every motion slow and precise. From this higher ground, he could see not just where the predators were, but how they were thinking, how they were reacting. This wasn't about speed. It wasn't even about distance. It was about turning their perfect hunt into something just flawed enough for him to slip through. When the moment came, Maddox didn't hesitate. He moved laterally along the ridge, staying hidden beneath the vine curtain, positioning himself for the next approach. Below him, the predators shifted again, unaware that their grid was now compromised in ways no prey had ever forced before. He had the vantage. He had the time. And for the first time since entering the arena, Maddox wasn't just surviving the predator test. He was actively shaping it. From the ridge, Maddox could feel the change in the hunt. The predators weren't disoriented, but their movements had sharpened. The false scent loop had done its work, but predators adapted quickly. It was only a matter of time before they recalculated and restored their coverage. Already, two hunters had shifted their arcs, angling wider to compensate for the gaps that had opened in the grid. The formation wasn't symmetrical anymore. It was overextended. That overextension was dangerous, but Maddox understood it wasn't the kind of danger he could exploit head-on. If they had committed more pressure toward the ridge, he couldn't afford to stay there. Staying meant being forced into the angles they controlled. He angled his path laterally, moving across the vertical face of the ridge rather than climbing higher. His hands gripped roots and vines, every movement slow and controlled to avoid drawing attention. The ridge's slope was broken and uneven, fractured by long growth lines of vegetation. These vertical breaks worked in his favor, creating strips of shadow and cover that let him move without a clean line of sight from below. He didn't try to descend. Going down would put him back in the open lanes where the predators had better angles. Instead, he shifted sideways, conserving stamina by keeping his pace steady. Maddox had learned in Earth jungles that fatigue killed as effectively as predators. A final sprint would come, but not yet. Below, the predators continued to realign. They were adjusting their hunt in a way that was precise but slightly irregular. The kind of movement that happened when multiple hunters were compensating for a disruption that wasn't part of their usual rhythm. Maddox watched their arcs through gaps in the leaves, studying the brief hesitations in their movement. Every time one doubled back to cover an opening, there was a pause. That pause was time, and time was all he needed to keep them at the pace he wanted. As he moved laterally, he scanned ahead for terrain features that could give him another layer of control. His eyes caught a cluster of dark, rounded shapes hanging from a thick branch that arched across the slope. It was a hive structure, compact, segmented, and bristling with slow movement. Maddox had seen enough alien ecosystems by now to recognize what it meant: a colony of aggressive insects, likely territorial. In Earth jungles, he'd learned to respect insect colonies as much as predators. They weren't lethal in most cases, but they were disruptive. In a hunt that depended on precision and timing, disruption could be more valuable than injury. He approached carefully, keeping his movements subtle so as not to trigger the hive too soon. The predators were still distant enough that the noise wouldn't carry, but this wasn't about immediate payoff. Maddox wasn't looking for a distraction now. He wanted something delayed, something that would hit when the predators had committed themselves to their final sweep. Using the flat of his machete, he scraped lightly along the bark, just enough to disturb the outer edge of the hive. The insects responded in slow waves, some shifting along the branch, others rising briefly before settling again. Maddox didn't linger. He moved past without drawing attention to the area, but the hive's agitation would grow. By the time the predators moved into range, the disruption would be waiting. Up in the observation deck, the Quran began flagging minor anomalies in the predator formation. They noted the irregular spacing, the slight delay in certain arcs. It was logged as environmental variance, normal enough when hunts took place in dense jungle. The predators had adapted to countless conditions. Variations in coverage were considered part of the process. No one on the deck suspected the pattern had been engineered by Maddox's decisions. They still viewed his survival as a combination of timing and environmental familiarity. It was a dangerous assumption, but one Maddox had counted on from the moment he entered the arena. The jungle ahead began to shift. The ridgeline tapered, the ground below flattening into broken layers of root and soil. Beyond this point, the terrain opened into a wider channel leading toward the final clearing. Maddox knew the predator's patterns well enough now to recognize the tightening sweep. This was the approach to the kill zone. Every species that had failed before him had been driven into this space, thinking it was an opportunity to sprint to the beacon. It wasn't. The predator's formation was designed to compress the prey's movement, forcing them into open ground where every exit was cut off. He paused at the edge of the ridge, crouching in a dense knot of vine growth. The predators were close again. The sound of their movement was faint but steady, the ground below carrying the subtle vibration of coordinated steps. They were compressing their arcs, preparing for the final engagement. Maddox didn't move. The closer they came, the more he needed their focus fixed on their own timing. He could feel the shift in the air. They were no longer sweeping as a grid. They were moving in a tightening convergence. The tension built in silence. Maddox stayed low, his body still, every movement measured in fractions. The insects he had disturbed earlier would be active by now. He couldn't hear them yet, but he didn't need to. He wasn't counting on a dramatic reaction, just enough disturbance to disrupt predator patience at the right moment. He shifted his weight slightly, scanning the path ahead. From this position, he could see the narrow approaches leading into the clearing. The predator's timing had to be exact to keep those paths sealed. If anything disrupted even one part of the formation, the perimeter could be breached for a brief window. Maddox wasn't counting on a gap. He was planning for one. The predators continued forward, the timing of their convergence crisp. But the pace was no longer their own. It was being dictated by the adjustments they'd been forced to make over the past hour. The Quran still didn't see it, still assuming this was part of the natural hunt. Maddox knew better. Every second they had spent reacting to him instead of driving him was a second he had been shaping their movement. As he settled into position, Maddox's breathing slowed. The final clearing was close. The predators were close. The hive would be in their path soon. He wasn't rushing forward to meet them. He was waiting for them to commit to their timing. Once they did, he would move, not through their strongest angles, but through the momentary space their own discipline created. The hunt was entering its final stage. The predators believed they had narrowed the noose. Maddox knew the noose was only as strong as its weakest strand, and he had spent the entire test weakening it, one quiet adjustment at a time. The ridge flattened and the jungle thinned ahead until the canopy opened into pale light. Maddox could see the glint of the beacon through the veil of leaves, a distant metallic point anchored in the center of the clearing. Around it, the ground lay bare. No roots, no undergrowth, no cover. It was the kill zone. Every participant who had come this far had seen it as both salvation and death sentence. The moment they broke the tree line, the predators collapsed in from every angle. Speed didn't save them. No one could cross open ground before the net closed. From his vantage, Maddox studied the clearing for longer than most would dare. The predators were already in motion, tightening their perimeter. Their arcs were practiced and precise, a geometry of lethal patience. The Quran observers leaned forward in expectation. This was the point in every hunt where confidence returned to their faces. The test had played out this way dozens of times, no matter what variation the prey introduced. Earlier, the final convergence at the clearing was perfect. The beacon became bait. The predators became inevitability. But Maddox wasn't moving. He crouched low beneath a sweep of vine cover, waiting for the pressure to build. The hive he had disturbed earlier lay somewhere in the predator's path. Timing mattered more than position now. He didn't need them scattered, just misaligned. His eyes followed the arcs, watching for any break in rhythm. From his concealed position, he saw the lead predator pause, its head tilting slightly towards something off-pattern. A faint sound carried in the air, the erratic drone of insect wings. Maddox didn't smile. He only shifted his weight lower, readying to move. The swarm hit in seconds. It wasn't a wall of insects, just an irritated mass spilling from the disturbed hive into the predator's path. The stinging cloud wasn't lethal to them, but it was a disruption. Two hunters broke stride, their timing shifting as they swiped at the sudden cloud around their limbs and heads. The disruption wasn't dramatic. It was seconds. But in a hunt built on perfect synchronization, seconds were damage. The perimeter's rhythm faltered. Maddox moved, not forward, not in the direction the predators expected, but low and lateral, sliding down from the ridge along an angled approach. His body kept low, crawling under the cover of vine and broken ground. The predator's focus was momentarily tilted toward their disrupted flank. The Quran observers didn't see the danger yet. To them, it looked like a minor environmental glitch, something the predators would correct in a heartbeat. But the heartbeat was enough. Maddox didn't sprint. Sprinting was noise, motion, visibility. He crawled along the perimeter's blind side, his profile masked by the disrupted arcs. The predators were still converging, still lethal, but their perfect encirclement had shifted just far enough to leave a sliver of space along the edge. The clearing opened before him. The beacon stood at the center, its surface catching the filtered light. From every other angle, it looked like a trap. From Maddox's angle, it was a target with just enough path between it and the closing arcs to make the difference. The predators had not registered him. Their sweep was still collapsing inward toward the assumed approach lines. Maddox pushed forward, keeping his weight low to the ground, moving in bursts of controlled motion. He didn't look up. He didn't look at the beacon. Every move was measured against the predator's rhythm, his progress hidden in the noise of their own corrections. From the observation deck, the Quran began to sense something was wrong. The predator's arcs weren't closing cleanly. Two were still slightly out of position, compensating for the insect disruption. The others were adjusting, but their timing wasn't perfect. A narrow gap had formed, so narrow it looked unintentional. But to someone who had studied their movement for hours, it was exactly what Maddox had been working toward. He emerged from the tree line not at the open edge, but along the angle no challenger had used before. The predators didn't expect a low crawl from a ridge vector. Their vision was focused forward on the assumed rush. Maddox's entry was a shadow at the fringe of their perception, slipping through the disruption they hadn't accounted for. The ground between him and the beacon felt impossibly exposed, but his timing was exact. The predators were seconds behind their own pattern. He moved without pause, each step low, each motion smooth. The beacon was closer now, its base marked with the faint grooves of previous failed attempts. Scars left by competitors who had reached this far and no further. Maddox reached the beacon before the predators could adjust. His hand closed over its frame, the surface warm from the energy coursing through it. The predators turned too late, their arcs snapping toward his position, but the moment had already passed. The Quran board froze in silence. The net hadn't closed. The hunt wasn't finished. Maddox had the beacon. The silence stretched in the observation tier. The Quran couldn't intervene without breaking their own rules. The predators stopped their advance, their formation still lethal but no longer necessary. Maddox stood in the center of the clearing, the beacon in his grip, the open ground around him a space no one had ever crossed alive. In the stands there was no cheer, no applause, only a shift in the air as every envoy present processed what they had seen. The predator test wasn't meant to be passed. It had been passed, and not by overwhelming strength, but by controlled, deliberate manipulation of the hunt itself. Maddox's final move had been the quietest part of the test and the most decisive. The clearing remained silent in the moments after Maddox's hand closed over the beacon. The predators stood still, their formation intact but motionless, waiting for the signal to disengage. The Quran deck, usually quick to issue the official end call, hesitated. The rules of the predator test had always been absolute. Once the beacon was touched by a living participant, the trial was over. Yet the Quran observers looked down at the humans standing in the open ground, their expressions unreadable. Intervention was impossible without contradicting decades of precedent. To alter the outcome now would not only break the rules, it would expose the challenge itself as an instrument of manipulation. That political cost was too high to pay in front of a gallery full of allied representatives. The Quran director raised a hand slowly and gave the signal. The predators relaxed their stance and withdrew from the clearing. Their hunt ended not in the decisive close they had been trained for, but in something more rare: withdrawal without a kill. Maddox didn't raise the beacon overhead, didn't celebrate. He stepped out of the open ground and walked toward the gate at a measured pace, as if the test was still active until he crossed back into the shadow of the canopy. That lack of display only deepened the quiet in the stands. This wasn't a performance, it was a result. When Maddox stepped into the receiving bay, the formal announcement was made. The predator test had been completed by a human participant. The official notation added a qualifier, non-repeatable due to environmental variance. But the distinction meant little in the wider record. No matter how the Quran tried to frame it, the event was on record. Every envoy in the observation tier had seen it themselves. Earth's petition for inclusion in frontier operations could no longer be dismissed. The result was logged, broadcast, and filed with the Alliance Registry before the Quran Council had even cleared the room. Political consequences moved quickly. Within days, Earth was admitted into frontier operations not as a symbolic participant, but with a specialist classification for asymmetric environments. Maddox's run was quietly referenced in closed war council sessions as an example of unconventional methods the Quran had not accounted for. His name wasn't put on parades or banners, but the report circulated among commanders who studied operational edge cases. It was clear to them that the test had not been won by chance or brute force, but by applied environmental manipulation. That detail was harder for the Quran to dismiss because it suggested that human adaptability wasn't a fluke. It was a capability. The Quran responded in their own way. Within a cycle, the predator test was modified, environmental randomness was introduced, predator behavior algorithms adjusted to remove exploitable patterns. Officially, the changes were part of routine calibration. Unofficially, they were a direct reaction to Maddox's run. Yet even with the modifications, the archived simulation of his trial remained untouched. It was marked unsolved by replication. Other species attempted to mimic aspects of his approach, but without his background, timing, and patience, they failed. The test returned to its role as an unbroken challenge, but the record of one completion remained embedded in its history. In the war councils, the phrase, "humanity passes," became a shorthand. It was entered as a single-line notation in the logs of the Joint Defense Committee. There was no expanded commendation, no additional commentary, just the fact of completion. But for those who worked in strategy and deployment, the notation carried weight. It meant Earth's forces could no longer be excluded from scenarios where adaptability and environmental control could alter the outcome. It was a small line in an official record, but strategically it was a door that could not be closed again. Maddox returned to Earth with little ceremony. There were no public interviews, no political tours. He returned to his unit quietly, resuming training cycles without remark. To him, the value of the test had never been in the spectacle. He hadn't entered expecting applause. What mattered was that the test design, meant to humiliate, had been turned into a proof of concept. Survival was not an accident. It could be engineered through understanding, preparation, and the deliberate exploitation of assumptions. That was the real victory, and it was one that would outlast his name in the public record. Among the smaller circles of military and diplomatic strategy, the story became a kind of legend, not because of how it looked, but because of what it meant. A single human had walked into an unwinnable scenario, not to defy it with strength, but to alter it with precision. The Predator test remained, still lethal, still undefeated by any who came after. But in the archive, there was one entry that read differently. And for those who studied that entry, the lesson was clear. In environments where the rules were written to make you lose, the key wasn't to fight harder. It was to rewrite the rules without announcing it. Maddox understood that better than anyone. The test had ended in the clearing, but the impact continued. He had proven that survival, when approached as strategy, could change the shape of a battlefield before the battle was even recognized. That was the value of what he had done. Not a military win in the traditional sense, but a shift in perception that could not be reversed. In the long memory of the frontier, the test would be remembered not as a game the Quran always won, but as the one they once lost. And that was enough. If this story kept you on edge, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY missions. Now we want to hear from you. If you had one shot at the Predator test, what Earthborn tactic would you use to make it out alive? Drop your strategy in the comments. We read every single one. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where strategy wins wars before the first shot is fired. See you in the next story.